video focuses on how to write your analytical response to a text essay, particularly how to write the response section. Let's take a few moments to review the article that you are responding to, Wikipedia as a Site of Knowledge Production by Danah Boyd. Now, academic writing is an ongoing conversation. Every author is entering into a conversation that is already happening about a topic. We listen or we read, and then we join in by debating through conversation, actual talking to people, or we write, which is a form of talking back to the authors we've read, the news that we've heard, and this is exactly what Boyd is doing. She's entering a conversation that is already being had about Wikipedia, which is full of different views, and she learns more about those views through her research and interviewing students and teachers, and a lot of these opinions we are all already aware of because we've heard them from people in our lives too. There are, your general internet readers, any of us, who find Wikipedia useful for learning more about a topic, and they probably differ in their opinions on whether Wikipedia is accurate or trustworthy, or how in-depth it is compared to other sources they might look at. And then you have the perspective of some students who are wondering, why can't I use Wikipedia as a source in my paper? And they are told by some educators, no, you cannot. It's unreliable, it's inaccurate, it's not an academic source. And then there are other teachers who may say, well, I use Wikipedia too, and it can be useful, but there are better sources you can use for a paper. So what Boyd is interested in is if we have so many different ideas about Wikipedia and its usefulness, its appropriateness, its credibility, then, how do we get to the bottom of what Wikipedia is good for? And Boyd comes up with her own ideas and arguments about that topic. So what idea about Wikipedia is Boyd bringing to the conversation? What are her thoughts about Wikipedia's value? Well, hopefully by now you have a sense of Boyd's argument. You've had practice summarizing it. And so we know that Boyd is taking a stance on Wikipedia and its usefulness and its trustworthiness even that is quite different than a lot of educators. Now, how she structures her argument is an important part of how she's trying to reach you as a reader and convince you that what she has to say is important and valuable. So the basic pattern she uses is that she sets up the opposition and then responds and counter argues. So she will say, well, some teachers say this, but actually, and she's like, well, some people say Wikipedia is, unreliable because anyone can edit it, but actually, studies have shown it's more, or it's just as or more accurate than something like the Encyclopedia Britannica. So that is often her pattern initially, is to recognize that there are common complaints or concerns, and then she seeks to oppose them and prove them to be misconceptions. And then she provides us with evidence of positive educational uses of Wikipedia. And then she actually does something a little bit different than you might be used to. She builds toward her thesis, which is really ultimately revealed in the conclusion of her paper. If you're reading carefully, you should know her opinion as you go, but she really drives it home in her conclusion. So what is the argument that Boyd is fighting against? How would we characterize the opposite of her perspective? Well, basically it's what students tell her that they've been told by their teachers, that Wikipedia is unreliable due to not citing not citing sources, not knowing who's writing it, and inaccurate information. And so she's seeking to dispel those notions, or at least to show that those things are not always true or always bad. She's offering a more complex view of Wikipedia than simply don't use it. So it's something that might be of interest and relevance to a lot of us as readers. And so you need to be asking yourself as you're developing your introduction, your summary, and what you decide to focus on in your response section. What is Boyd's argument, and do you agree with it or not? Or do you maybe think she has some good points and some that you're not buying into? So the ultimate question is, why does Dana Boyd think Wikipedia's bad rap in American K-12 education is undeserved? And what advantages does she think that the site actually provides? And like I said, she really gives us, probably the fullest picture of her argument in her conclusion when she says, what Wikipedia does well is combine and present information from many sources in a free, publicly accessible, understandable way, while also revealing biases and discussions that went into the production of that content. Even with their limitations and weaknesses, projects like Wikipedia are important for educational efforts because they make the production of knowledge more visible. They also highlight a valuable way of using technology to create opportunities for increased digital literacy. So we're going to take a look at these ideas a bit more in depth in this video. What does Dana Boyd mean when she refers to the discussions about the production of content? And what are some of the limitations and weaknesses that she recognizes that Wikipedia does have? But why does she still think it is important, it is valuable, and what is exactly the production of knowledge? Because we know that the title of this essay says that Wikipedia is a site of knowledge production. So that's obviously pretty key, and I do want to make sure that we understand that a bit better, because it might be something that you want to talk about more in the response section of your paper. So now that we have a sense of what Boyd's major argument is, let's review the main points that she makes throughout her essay. She says that, lack of experience using Wikipedia more fully can cut you off from using it effectively. Many teachers distrust Wikipedia's accuracy and credibility because they don't know about those features, and they tell students not to use it. But students continue to use it anyway. And so the lack of guidance from adults on how digital information works can confuse students. Instead of just saying Wikipedia is unreliable and don't use it, Boyd believes that we should learn what makes internet sources credible in the first place. And so something like the History tab on Wikipedia, which allows you to see the evolution of knowledge, Boyd thinks that that's interesting compared to static sources that don't always evolve as quickly as a page that can be updated. You have to wait until a new edition of the textbook comes out. She also points out that textbooks don't always contain 100% factual information because they grow outdated and they can also be biased. The beliefs of an author influence how information is shared and the viewpoint of how even something like history is told. Wikipedia, on the other hand, allows for conflicting topics to be disputed and serves as a history of how knowledge evolves when different people's perspectives are brought to the table. Boyd talks about the usefulness of Wikipedia's discussion feature and how people come together to eliminate simple issues and then thoroughly make the entry understandable to the readers. Most of the teens that she talked to didn't know about the full features of Wikipedia, like the history and discussion pages, and Boyd sees this as a missed opportunity because they could learn things by engaging in discussions and debates. She points out that Wikipedia is a work in progress. It does have its faults, and although it's constantly being revised, it has the benefit of raising new issues and introducing new ideas. She also points out that, many of Wikipedia's articles are heavily vetted and relied upon by historians, that Wikipedia is an important tool, not just for knowledge, but for increasing digital literacy if students learn how to use it more responsibly and effectively. Just the idea of debating over Wikipedia's usefulness encourages us to think about what kind of information do we trust? What makes a source reliable or credible? How do we learn? How do we gain knowledge? And so Boyd's article has quite a bit that you could respond to. All of these points that she's making, you want to narrow in on one or two that you would like to talk about because you agree or disagree, because you have a connection or an example from your own life that you could relate to it, something that you just want to expand upon that you think she could have gone into in more depth. There's a lot of places where you can enter a conversation with Boyd's article. Now, Boyd has talked about the importance of digital literacy. This is something that you'll learn quite a bit about in ENC 1102 when you really focus on research methods. And so much of the research and the reading that we now do is conducted online. And we cannot assume that everything we read online is true or unbiased. And so in a digital world, we really need to think about what makes our sources of information credible. What makes a source acceptable for academic writing versus personal edification? And that's something that I don't want to go too far into depth to right now, but because it's something that Boyd is interested in and you might choose to focus on in your response because you as a student have experience with these questions of what makes a source credible or how to figure out if it's accurate, it's worth taking a look at some of the ways in which we might question the sources we read and how Wikipedia itself deals with those questions, because they are very aware that there could be questions of credibility and accuracy that are lobbed against its website. And so you might find the Research 101 guide at the library website to be useful. So you can click on the guides page and you'll see that they actually cover a lot of different stuff. And so I am going to go to the research guide. And so here you can get advice about how to conduct research, whether it's through books and ebooks, finding articles online. We have databases through the library where you can find articles that you might not be able to just on Google. But I want to, for the purposes of this video, just take a quick look at the library's advice on evaluating internet sources. And so basically you want to ask yourself questions. Who wrote it? What are their qualifications? What's the purpose of the website that includes the article that you're reading? When was it last updated? How up to date and accurate is it? Where did the writer get their information? Do they cite their sources? Can you verify the information that's provided? And so these are all questions that we would ask of a Wikipedia article. So we don't know who has written a Wikipedia page, which is why we might call into question its credibility. Now, we can find out more about the Wikipedia website's process, how they try to determine the accuracy of their articles, what they do to be transparent about the writing and revising process on Wikipedia. We can see when things have been updated. We can see the debates that the writers have over, what is the most accurate and fair information. So these same questions we can apply to any kind of internet research we do, but they are relevant for thinking about Wikipedia as a site of knowledge production, as Danah Boyd is encouraging us to do. So let's take a look at the Wikipedia page. If you go to Wikipedia, as many of you have been here at some point for something, then we can see some interesting things. So there's always a featured article, may or may not be of interest. We'll see what's in the news, and you can visit Wikipedia pages that are being updated to, cover, the latest and sometimes controversial information. And right up here, you can see, we're going to come back to this, the talk and contributions, the history of the different pages. But right now, I want to take a look at the About Wikipedia page so that we can learn more about Wikipedia. And so if we take a look here, the site actually addresses some of the things that teachers have concerns about and that Boyd's article talks about. And so I think it's useful to think about these things. So if we take a look at the Making the Best Use of Wikipedia section, we can see that using Wikipedia for research is covered, Wikipedia versus traditional paper encyclopedias, the strengths, weaknesses, and qualities of Wikipedia. So they're obviously very aware of the debates that people have. So let's look at this section. So there's some good information here. I'm going to just take a quick look at some of it. But we can see that Wikipedia is addressing the very issues that comes up in Boyd's article. So they say that wiki documents, wiki pages, and articles are never considered complete and may be continually edited and improved. They believe that over time, this generally results in an upward trend of quality and a growing consensus over a neutral representation of information. And this is something Boyd has talked about, that when there are many people working together, collaborating, that ideally we get better information over time. But Wikipedia does point out that users should be aware that not all articles are of encyclopedic quality from the start. They may contain false or debatable information. Indeed, many articles start their lives as displaying a single viewpoint, and after a long process of discussion, debate, and argumentation, they gradually take on a neutral point of view reached through consensus. Now, that's exactly what Boyd points out is one of the strengths of Wikipedia, but it's important to recognize that not every article has reached that state. It might still be biased, it might still be inaccurate. And so you need, if you're going to look at Wikipedia for knowledge of any sort, you need to read it critically. You need to be aware of its strengths and its weaknesses. And that is ultimately why it's not accepted as a college source in most papers, but we often still use it ourselves. And the research we do just when we want to know more about something should be something that we're still thinking about critically. And so we also see that Wikipedia recognizes that pages can become caught up in a heavily unbalanced viewpoint, which can take time, months, or years to achieve a better balanced coverage of the subject. And so, they recognize that there are some downsides. They say that their ideal article is well written, balanced, neutral, and encyclopedic, containing comprehensive, notable, verifiable knowledge. You may have noticed when looking at Wikipedia pages that if you scroll to the bottom, you can often find sources cited, which is what you want to see. You want to see a Wikipedia page that is based on research. If it's not, then that's one of those pages you really can't trust yet. And so they discuss these aspects. They talk about Wikipedia versus paper encyclopedias. What are some of the pros? Well, Wikipedia is not limited to a certain amount of pages. It can grow indefinitely. There are no qualifications required to be able to author the articles. Now, that could be a good thing and a bad thing. It means you get more perspectives, but it means you get a mixture of professionals and amateurs. But this does mean, as Wikipedia points out, that it is the most comprehensive encyclopedia on Earth. No encyclopedia covers as many topics as Wikipedia. Now, their third point here that Boyd is very interested in is that while a paper encyclopedia or textbook remains static, it stays the same and falls out of date until you get a new edition, Wikipedia is dynamic. You don't have to wait for the next edition to come out because it's published online, it's written online, it's updated constantly. You could update it. If you find out something and you see the Wikipedia page for it isn't up to date yet. And so those are the strengths, but also potentially weaknesses as well. And here they have a whole section devoted to that, the strengths and weaknesses. And you can see they even have pages that go into even further depth that are probably written by a combination of people who are debating behind the scenes about why it's great, why it's not, if it's reliable, if you can use it for research. But here are some of the points that they make that Boyd is also interested in. Wikipedia has a large contributor base, and so you get people with diverse backgrounds. And ideally, this allows Wikipedia to significantly reduce regional and cultural bias found in many publications and makes it very difficult for any person or group to censor and impose bias. And you can imagine how important this is in countries where information is regularly censored, is determined by the government. And so Wikipedia has the possibility to be open and diverse. It depends on the page, though, and it depends on who is choosing to be a part of Wikipedia and to edit it. But there is that potential that Wikipedia is broader and becomes less biased, more neutral. Allowing anyone to edit Wikipedia, though, also has its downside, and they readily admit that a page can be easily vandalized and susceptible to unverified information and might need to be removed. They say that while this is usually spotted and rapidly corrected, something could stick around for a while before somebody challenges it. It really depends upon how active people like you and me are in reading and editing Wikipedia pages. And so here they point out the pros and the cons of this process of anybody being able to contribute. Censorship or imposing official points of view is difficult and usually fails. So if people are working together, they're eliminating the bias and becoming more neutral, more ideal as a source. But this process can be long and drawn out. People might argue for days, months, years over what to include in the Wikipedia page, how to get it neutral. And reaching neutrality is made harder by what they call extreme viewpoint contributors, people who are probably very, very on the one side of an issue versus another. And so you could see how that could be problematic, and there's a whole page about it. And so Wikipedia has a full editorial dispute resolution process where if there are really some problems happening, it can be reported and dealt with, but that is a process. And you need to be able to remember that when you're looking at information on Wikipedia, that these things are possible. So we've got a lot of different things to consider about how Wikipedia is useful and not useful, good and bad. It's perhaps not a black and white issue of never use Wikipedia or always use Wikipedia. And certainly I will tell you, do not use Wikipedia as a source in a college paper because it is not accepted as across the board an academic source. But it's an important lesson to consider what determines a source to be credible. How do we get information? Most of us are not regularly searching library databases when we want to know more about something. We Google it, and the first source that generally comes up is a Wikipedia page. And so if we are going to use that information in our day-to-day lives, we should be more critical consumers and maybe even contributors to the Wikipedia process. And so now that we've taken a look at how Wikipedia talks about itself, that it recognizes its strengths and weaknesses, let's go back to Boyd. So what is knowledge anyway? From the title of the article itself, we know that Boyd is interested in the production of knowledge. And she claims that Wikipedia is a site of knowledge production. So what does it mean to produce knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? How do we create or produce it? We usually talk about receiving knowledge. I am more knowledgeable about something after I have read a book, completed a course, received a degree. But who produces that knowledge that we receive, and how does that happen? Who writes the book? Who teaches the course? What did you have to do to get the degree? Ideally, these are interactive processes with many different perspectives involved. Our textbook has multiple authors, for instance, and if you look at the beginning of the book, you'll see that they list all of the different colleges and professors that they consulted to build a book to guide you through college writing. You have many different professors at Santa Fe who have different expertise and teaching styles, and hopefully they encourage you to be a part of the learning process. I become more knowledgeable about things because of my students and what they write about and the different topics they get into. And I think that, in the peer review process, you learn from each other. So knowledge is not something that is just passively received, but it's something that is produced. There's a process behind it that is valuable for us to understand better. So knowledge is not just produced by one textbook writer. And Boyd points out that with Wikipedia, we can see knowledge being produced in a unique way if we look behind the scenes, as we can see in the discussion and history pages where there are debates and collaboration and revision, the stuff that builds a product of knowledge that we then read and learn from. Looking behind the curtain of Wikipedia can teach us about how complex information and learning actually is. Whether the writers are right or wrong, when you look at the Wikipedia discussion page, you can see the contribution and debates about information that are happening. You can see the history of edits being made. Boyd gives us examples of this when she talks about how the American Revolution is covered differently in different textbooks, whether it's one read in America or England. And then in the same way, she also noted that the Wikipedia entry for the American Revolution, through the history and discussion page, you could see debates over, certain words, certain ways of referring to both sides of the American Revolution. And so we're seeing behind the curtain and seeing how the knowledge that, we normally just think of, I'm going to read this and know this, how it's actually produced, how it comes to be. So, and as Boyd points out, most people don't know about these features. Certainly the students that she talked to, didn't know how Wikipedia worked beyond simply that anyone can edit it. They didn't know about the discussion page or the history of edits. You might not have known about it either. And so these are the things that we've learned from Boyd's essay that you might consider reflecting upon in your paper in some way. And so we can see that Boyd really wants to emphasize how complex information and learning actually is. In some ways, Boyd's article is not just about Wikipedia, and it's definitely not about the simple question of, or maybe not so simple question, of whether or not you should be allowed to use Wikipedia as a source in a paper. Really, her essay is about knowledge and learning and thinking about the process of receiving information more critically, especially in a digital world like ours and with a site like Wikipedia. She really uses this as an example to investigate a broader concern when it comes to education and learning. So as I hope you can see, there's a lot you could talk about in the response section of your paper. Your goal is to narrow in on a particular part or a few ideas that Boyd raises that you've developed opinions on. Your response section can't and shouldn't try to cover the whole article. I want to go over a few different ways that you might approach your response section of the paper. One idea is to try to answer a question. In your textbook, these questions are listed at the end of Boyd's article, and one or more of them might be interesting to you. You could use them as a jumping off point for your response section. You wouldn't actually copy paste one of these questions like you might do for homework, but you could think about developing a paragraph that is inspired by one of them. So you might discuss, the advantages that Boyd thinks Wikipedia has and how you agree or disagree. You might discuss whether or not you think her assessment of Wikipedia is balanced and fair. You might discuss your own experiences with Wikipedia and education. You might just go over other points in the essay that you agree or disagree with as far as Wikipedia's usefulness goes. So you would quote or paraphrase particular parts of Boyd's essay, and then you would talk back. You would join the conversation and respond. because that's what an analytical response to a text is. It really is about responding. When we talk about analysis, we're talking about a detailed examination of something, complex in order to understand its nature or its essential features. Basically, to understand an article better is to break it down, look at part by part, and in your case, you're going to narrow in on some specific ideas that you want to investigate more deeply. And so some questions you want to ask yourself with this paper is, well, what do I think about the article? What points do I agree or disagree with? What kind of connections can I draw to the article? And, why does this topic matter? Or why do I think it doesn't matter? There's, again, a lot of different ways you can approach writing the response section of your paper. Now, the paper as a whole has different parts. You have an introduction, you have your summary, the response, the conclusion, and the works cited page. So your summary should stay short. It should really be between 100 to 150 words. The response section should be your longest section. You might have 1 or 2 paragraphs in which you narrow your focus and say, okay, these are some parts of Boyd's essay that I want to get into more deeply and share my opinion on. In the response section, you really are focusing on your thoughts and opinions in response to specific points from Boyd's article. So your goals are to quote, paraphrase, and cite Boyd properly. That's one of the big takeaways from this assignment that I want you to carry with you into future assignments and courses. And I want you to feel like you are joining an academic conversation, that you get to expand upon what you've read with your own opinions and experiences. That's the beauty of this assignment, is your voice matters. Your opinion is something we want to bring to the forefront in these response paragraphs. And so, as I've said, there's many different ways you can respond, many different things you can do with those paragraphs. In chapter 3, when you learned about summarizing and responding, there were basically 3 kind of categories that the book talks about. One is in which you essentially respond to what the text says. So agreeing or disagreeing, and you would explain that opinion that you have based upon something particular Boyd said. Another strategy is to focus on the way the text is written. How does Boyd make her argument? You pick apart her research or her logic. That might appeal to some of you. Or you could get more personal. You could bring in your own experiences, beliefs, experiences you've had with Wikipedia or education. Those are things that are valid for this essay too. You can use the word I. Try not to overdo it. Not every sentence should feature the word, but this is your response, and so it should be whatever you want to focus on, as long as it connects back to Boyd's paper. You'll need to choose particular parts of the article and react to them with your own personal opinion and experience. Another key component of a response section is that your response includes specific references to the text through quotes or paraphrases, so you're not just using the article as a springboard for your own ideas and going off on a tangent, but you're reacting very specifically to particular elements of the text. And so here are some other ways that you might consider responding. Again, agreeing or disagreeing. You could reflect, examine the ways in which the article has affected your thinking on the topic of Wikipedia. You could kind of build on some of Boyd's points and add in how your experiences contradict or, maybe expand upon some of Boyd's points. You could extend the ideas that Boyd brings up further and see how they might apply to different situations. So the things that she has to say about, the American Revolution Wikipedia page, could you test out, the discussion and history sections of a different Wikipedia page that, maybe is about a topic that you're interested in or you think is probably heavily debated, and see if Boyd's right. You could look at different pages and see if you think they're credible, if you think they do what Boyd believes Wikipedia is capable of in its best, manifestations. And again, you could Examine the strength of her actual written argument. How well does she support her ideas? Does she overlook anything in her defense of Wikipedia? You can argue against her, or you can express agreement. Any number of possibilities here. A few more questions that you could maybe use as starting points. And some of these things are, really just building off of each other. I just want to give you some ways to think about how to approach the response section. So ask yourself, what new ideas or insights has Boyd's article given you? Does it support or challenge any of your beliefs or opinions? Again, do you agree or disagree? What connections can you draw between Boyd's essay and other knowledge or experience that you have? And big picture, in what ways does the essay help you to understand issues about academic writing and research in general, and not just with Wikipedia? Because it's really an article about knowledge and learning in the world that we live in currently. Now, there are many different ways that you could respond to individual parts of Boyd's essay that interest you. So let's take a look at this as an example. There's a part of the chapter, or part of her essay, where Boyd discusses how different perspectives on history can be debated and resolved in the Wikipedia talk page, and readers can view this production of knowledge if they look behind the scenes on the entry for the American Revolution. We saw how people she knew, depending on where they lived, America or England, learned about the American Revolution in different ways. She also talked about how different language choices were debated in the creation of the Wikipedia page because of the bias or slant that a word choice can make. So the various people all over the world that were helping to edit and write and update a history page, something that happened a long time ago, there's still debates to be had. As Boyd pointed out, should the American colonists be referred to as patriots, revolutionaries, or insurgents? Those all have different connotations. Boyd finds the discussion pages on Wikipedia so interesting because they show knowledge in the process of production, and you yourself could take part. I've edited a Wikipedia page before when I thought it was incomplete or inaccurate or limited in its scope. And so there's opportunities here to even use Wikipedia in this paper as an example rather than as a source. So some different ways that you could take this part of Boyd's essay and respond back to it. You could take a look at the American Revolution page and judge for yourself. Write about what you find in more detail. If you were to take a look at the discussion, the history section, you could analyze whether this particular story, this example she gives about the Wikipedia page, does that help her argument? Is it good evidence for what she is saying about Wikipedia, or do you think she needs better evidence? You could, again, take this one instance from the article about the American Revolution, and you could talk about how you never knew about this part of Wikipedia, where you could see the edits people were making and the debates they were having about it. And you could talk about what you think about this new information you've learned. You could find a case study of your own. Research a Wikipedia page, again, of your interest or something you think might be controversial, and see if you can find a similar behind-the-scenes discussion and revision happening. You could write about what you see. So let's take a look, for example, at the American Revolution Wikipedia page. And so we could take a look at the exact features that Boyd's talking about. Now, since she wrote this article, there's, I'm sure, been a huge number of edits made, so the specific example she's talking about would be buried like way back in the history. But we can take a look at what's been happening currently so you can see, what she's talking about when she talks about viewing the history and seeing how knowledge is produced. And so you see this tab up here, click View History, and you could see all of the updates that have been made. So last one was on September 12th. We have some on September 7th. Now, not all of these are going to be fascinating. A lot of times it might just be changing a word, correcting grammar. But one that I did find interesting was somebody who on March 12th added more info on how women played significant roles in the American Revolution, including a section on camp followers and women gathering supplies for soldiers. So there's an example of someone saying, hey, you have overlooked women in this encyclopedia page about the American Revolution. And so they're contributing knowledge. And if somebody, wants to add further to that, does even more research, then, that's something that Wikipedia can do that a static paper source cannot, at least not without releasing another definition, or another edition rather. Go back to the main page, we can actually find that section. And so I'm going to go to the content, and let's go role of women. Here we go. And then this is something that received more information recently. And there's a main article apparently that goes into even more depth, but we have some information here on the main page, and we can see citations. And that's another important consideration. If you're reading Wikipedia articles, are sources cited? You could find out more information by checking out those sources. Now, this is a very thoroughly researched Wikipedia page. There are 215 sources cited, and then there's also a list of books and things you could go read to become even more knowledgeable. Because Wikipedia is a good start sometimes, but it's not the last stop for research. And that's certainly not something that Boyd is arguing for either. Then there is also the talk page that Boyd refers to, whereas the view history gives us a history of all the revisions that have been made, the talk page is where users come and debate over changes that have been made or unmade, and this is often where we can see collaboration, but also conflict happen. And the goal, as Boyd discusses, as Wikipedia itself advocates on its About page, is that this process is fruitful, that the debates will eventually reach agreement, and we end up with a more knowledgeable and hopefully neutral representation of history, in this case of the American Revolution. And so we can see what kinds of debates are currently happening. And so here is something that is very contemporary. So there's a whole section on whitesplaining. And so it is discussing edits that are made to how should we, use terms that are not racially loaded. And so here one user, Carl's Tack, has said, I don't object to the changes made by John D. Clark regarding what he calls the offensive and unnecessary term Indian, but he should know that there are Native American scholars, such as historian Donald Fixico, who have published many academic works that use the term Indian. There are also some Native Americans who find the term Indigenous offensive, as well as others who find Native Americans offensive. I don't know if John Clark is white or not, but white people who pronounce what is acceptable terminology are whitesplaining and appropriating the rightful prerogative of Native peoples to disagree among themselves on what is appropriate usage. And so here we see a debate happening over edits and who should be making them. And so if we're investigating what is the appropriate word to use for Native Americans in a history text, then probably it's best to listen to Native voices, people who, are coming in and editing the page and deciding, just like Boyd previously talked about the debate in this very article over how to refer to colonists. What kinds of terms should you use? Patriot, revolutionary, insurgent. They all carry different connotations. And so these are the kind of debates that are happening, right? And different people are contributing. John D. Clark has responded to these points that were raised. And so everybody's trying to engage with each other and come to a consensus. Now, I haven't read this in full. It's possible it gets quite heated, or maybe it's quite productive. I'm probably going to go back and read it in detail later. But this is exactly what Boyd is referring to, that we can see the creation, the production of knowledge taking place behind scenes. the sometimes messy process of coming to a consensus on what is a good encyclopedia entry to teach people about a topic. All of this is to say that in your paper, you might decide, I'm really interested in this part of Boyd's argument where she talks about the talk section or the history section, and I want to check it out for myself. And you could look up a Wikipedia page on anything, whatever you're interested in, or just something entirely random. There is a random function, random article. And so, and you could just investigate. What's the history page look like? Do I think it's useful? Do I think it's interesting? What does the talk section look like? And some pages might not have anything because there's not a lot of debates about it. This is just one option. By no means do you need to talk about this part of Boyd's essay, but I wanted to show you an example of the different kinds of ways you could respond to her essay depending upon which parts interested you and which things you have developed opinions on. So those are just some examples of different ways you could respond if this happened to be the part of Boyd's essay you found most interesting and you wanted to discuss it in your paper, the idea of the talk or the discussion page. And so you could do what I just did and check out the pages, whether it's American Revolution or something you pick yourself, and then reflect on if you think Boyd's right that those are useful and how or why not. Or you don't have to do that. You could talk about whether you just simply think it's convincing evidence for Boyd's argument, or if this was surprising information to you. So whatever you pick from Boyd's article to talk about, it's really up to you what you want to discuss. Just be specific. Now let's take a look at an example response paragraph. This one happens to focus on what the student agrees and disagrees with when it comes to the article. You could take a similar approach, but you don't have to. As I hope you're seeing, there are as many ways to respond to this article as there are people and ideas. The key is that you choose something specific that you want to talk about. So first we have the topic sentence that indicates what this paragraph is going to focus on very clearly. In trying to dispel some of the negative myths about Wikipedia, Boyd offers excellent examples of its merits that many people probably aren't aware of. And so we see here that our student thinks that Boyd has offered some great examples and they, maybe learned about some things they didn't know. For instance, she points out, there you see a signal phrase that you use when you are introducing a quote or a paraphrase. So she points out that if you look at the history of a Wikipedia page, you can see when someone made edits, who did the editing, and what the user edited. By looking at the discussion, it's possible to read the debates that surround the edits. Wikipedia isn't simply a product of knowledge, it's also a record of the process by which people share and demonstrate knowledge. Now that's a little bit lengthy of a quote. I would say try to trim things down a little bit if you can, or paraphrase some of it, but it's a good quote. You need to talk about a specific point like this writer has done. Now the student goes on to then share their opinion. This is an element of Wikipedia that I never knew about, and I think it would be interesting to look at, especially for controversial topics. While I agree with Boyd that it's okay to use Wikipedia to explore topics in more depth, I still don't think that Wikipedia can count as credible overall because ultimately anybody can go on there and put whatever they want. Checking out the discussions that Wikipedia editors have is a good idea when figuring out the page's accuracy. But how many readers will actually do this with every page they look at? Wikipedia's credibility is too much of a variable. All right, so this is this student's opinion. They've learned something new from Boyd's article. They've thought about it, seen some of the advantages or interesting things about it, but ultimately concluded that, well, that might not work out the way that Boyd hopes. People might not actually ever look at those things and consider, how accurate a Wikipedia page is based on the discussion or talk page or history page. And so this is just one example of a response. It's up to you what you want to focus on. There are many different things in the article that you could talk about, from the teacher opinions to the student experiences. the discussion of textbooks and bias. Whatever you want to focus on, try to be specific, include a quote or paraphrase in your paragraph, and then make sure you expand upon that by including your opinion in some way. What opinion you have is totally fine. It's entirely up to you. There's no right or wrong response as long as you follow a strategy. Now, it's time for you to think about what you want to write about. A few final tips here. Use a topic sentence that indicates the focus of the paragraph, like the one we just looked at. If you're going to talk about different aspects of Boyd's article, consider having more than one response paragraph. You might have two. Also, make sure to use signal phrases and citations to differentiate between your ideas and Boyd's. So when we look at the previous page, you can see that the signal phrase she points out and the citation of the page number. So we know that's Boyd and this is our student. You always want to make sure that's clear and avoid plagiarism. And then finally, as I've said again and again, be specific. Make sure that not only do you quote or paraphrase aspects of Boyd's article, but that you are specific in your own opinions. Don't simply say, I agree with many ideas in this article, right? Actually go into your thought process and your reasoning, because your reader is not inside your head. They don't know what you're thinking. You've got to tell them. So go ahead and start drafting your response paragraph or paragraphs. You'll get a chance to receive feedback from a classmate through the peer review process, and likewise, you'll provide feedback to someone else and get a chance to see what they think about this article.